What was the first time you remember hearing about the conflict between the Soviet Union and the United States? Tell me about it.
First time I remember hearing about the Cold War or the conflict between Russia and the U.S. was around the time of the 1980 Olympics. They were being held in Russia, and the United States boycotted the Olympic Games because of some of the things that Russia was doing. Um, Russia then boycotted the Olympic Games in 1984 when they were in New York.
What does the term Cold War mean to you? What do you remember seeing or reading in the news about the Cold War or conflict between the USSR and the United States?
To me, the Cold War, it was kind of a war that couldn't be fought because at the time everybody had nuclear weapons, and if a war had started, it would have escalated with the nuclear weapons and pretty much would have destroyed the entire world. I remember seeing things on the news all the time about, spying going on between Russia and the United States, and there's always, quite a bit of tension between the two countries.
What books, movies, cartoons, or posters did you see that villainized either country, capitalist, communist, or dealt with the Cold War? How did they shape your impressions at that time?
There were a lot of different books. The Born Identity, and then there were a couple others that went along with that. Had to do with spies and Russia and everything. There was The Hunt for Red October, which was about a Russian submarine captain who wanted to defect to come to the United States. The one that really stands out most to me is probably Red Dawn, which came out in the mid-'80s, and it was about the Russians invading America.
What were you taught in school and at home about the conflict? What did your school and family teach about nuclear threats and nuclear war?
What we were basically taught in school and at home was that if we went to war with Russia, it would be nuclear nuclear war, and it would pretty much be the end of the world. It was that bad if we were to go to war with them. Um, I remember being in school, and the way they have fire drills today, we used to have what's called air raid drills. The alarm would go off, and we would all run into the hallway and sit with our backs against the wall, holding our head in our hands to protect from falling debris in case they invaded. That was a little different than it is today.
Any of your family members ever afraid that there would be a hot war or nuclear war between the two countries? When did you feel that way? If yes, did you do anything to prepare or get ready for it?
We probably found, well, we talked about it, a fair amount, but we also, recognized that if there ever was, a hot war, um, there wasn't much that we could do about it. Where we lived, there were no basements, so we couldn't really go and hide in a basement or anything like that. Um, so we would pray whenever there was any, you know, a lot of talk about, the Russians and what they were going to do. We would pray quite a bit.
What aspects of the space race or competition to explore space do you remember? Was space race a phrase that you remember using at the time? What did it mean to you?
I remember the term space race, and it was kind of, who would do the most in space um, between the United States and Russia, really. Um, I was 2 years old when we put somebody on the moon. Um, we were the first. The United States was the first to put someone on the moon. The Russians had been the first to actually get up into space. Um, so there was a lot of. I used to hear the term space race. The other one I used to hear was Star Wars, which was the defense program that Ronald Reagan always talked about, where we would have something that would sit up in space that, in the event that Russia launched nuclear warheads at America, this Star Wars initiative would be there to actually shoot them out of the sky.
Can you think of any specific examples of rivalry between the USA and the USSR in other areas of life, such as sports?
Yeah, the thing I remember most is the 1980 Olympic hockey team. The United States was serious underdogs and it was mostly college kids playing on the team, where Russia had won. You know, they were always a favorite to win the gold medal, and a lot of their players were professionals, and the United States actually beat the Russians. I just remember how exciting it was, when all that was happening. They actually made a movie about it a few years ago. It's called Miracle.
Do you remember the Berlin Wall coming down? How did it make you feel? How have your feelings about that era changed since 1989 and the Berlin Wall coming down?
I was in college when the Berlin Wall came down in 1989. It was a really exciting time. That was such a symbol of communism and, the divided, you know, Eastern Europe and Russia and, all it stood for. Um, I know that Ronald Reagan and Pope John Paul II really played the biggest part in making sure that communism would fail. Um, and seeing the Berlin Wall come down was definitely a major symbol of communism and its failure.
What lessons should students today take away from the Cold War?
Um, don't take things for granted. You know, there's all kinds of threats out there today with terrorism and everything. Not to say that our time was better or worse than this time, but it was just different. Um, the the kids growing up back then, that's all we knew was the Cold War and the threat of nuclear war. Um, we didn't really think too much about it because we couldn't change it. And there's the terror threats that go on.
Did the war have any influence on your life?
Yeah, I think it did. We all had to be leery of what was happening in Russia and Eastern Europe. Never knowing if somebody was going to say the wrong thing or do the wrong thing and have this nuclear meltdown war, you know, take place, which would end all life as we knew it. Um, so from that perspective, it definitely had an impact. But like I said before, we couldn't let it define us. We couldn't let it be the only thing we ever think of. We had to go on living our lives.
Did you know anyone who fought in the war?
It wasn't a war that was fought in the traditional sense, like World War II, World War One, where there was fighting going on, face to face, people shooting each other. Um, but my cousin's husband was in the United States Coast Guard. He had to patrol the coastal waters of the United States all the way up into Alaska, looking for Russian submarines approaching our coast. Um, and I know he had to do the same thing off the coast of Long Island, where we grew up. So, from that perspective, yeah, I knew somebody who was involved, in the war and protecting us.
Okay, thank you for your time.
You're welcome.